Welcome. Today's story is not about love or celebration, but about silence, suffering, and a revenge so carefully hidden it unfolded in plain sight. On a day meant for vows and joy, a wedding feast became a funeral, and the hands that prepared the sweetest dishes carried a secret no one suspected. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you appreciate stories built on deep research and real historical records. Make sure you subscribe, because uncovering truths like this takes time, patience, and respect for the past. In the world of slavery, the domestic kitchen was not a place of comfort. It was a place of control. Enslaved cooks worked inside the homes of their enslavers, often closer to the family than any other enslaved person, yet with no protection from abuse or punishment. They rose before dawn, labored until night, and were expected to produce flawless meals regardless of exhaustion, illness, or grief. Every mistake, every delayed dish could bring severe consequences. The kitchen also represented a twisted form of trust. Slave-owning families depended on enslaved cooks to feed their children, guests, and themselves, believing obedience was guaranteed through fear. Yet this closeness did not mean respect. Enslaved cooks were routinely humiliated, beaten, or blamed for shortages they did not cause. Their knowledge, skill, and labor were exploited while their humanity was denied. For many enslaved women especially, the kitchen became a space where violence and vulnerability overlapped. They were isolated from the fields, watched constantly, and expected to remain invisible while performing perfection. At the same time, they learned the household's rhythms, who ate first, which dishes were reserved for special occasions, and what ingredients were kept under lock and key. Ironically, the domestic kitchen was one of the few places where enslaved people could gain specialized knowledge. Through forced labor, cooks learned the effects of plants, spices, and remedies, knowledge passed quietly through generations. This understanding, gained under oppression, would later become both a symbol of survival and, in rare moments, a silent form of resistance. Thus, the kitchen was not just a room, it was a battleground. A place where power was enforced daily, where obedience was demanded without mercy, and where the smallest actions could carry enormous, deadly consequences. The daily life of an enslaved cook was shaped by exhaustion, fear, and constant surveillance. Long before sunrise, she was already awake, lighting fires, grinding spices, kneading dough, and preparing breakfasts that would never be shared with her. There were no days off, no allowances for illness, and no recognition of skill. Her value was measured only by how perfectly she served others. Unlike field laborers, the cook worked indoors, but this did not mean safety or comfort. The kitchen was a confined space where mistakes were immediately visible and punishments were swift. A meal served late, food seasoned incorrectly, or supplies running short could result in beatings, food deprivation, or being sold away from family. Every dish carried pressure, because failure was never forgiven. The cook's position also meant isolation. She often worked alone or with minimal help, separated from other enslaved people, cut off from shared conversation and support. This isolation was intentional. It reduced the chance of resistance and reinforced dependence on the household. Silence became a survival skill. Listening more than speaking kept her alive. Her body belonged entirely to the household, She could be summoned at any hour, forced to work through nights for unexpected guests or celebrations. Holidays and weddings meant heavier workloads, not joy. While others celebrated, she labored endlessly, preparing elaborate meals she would never taste for events that symbolized a freedom denied to her. Yet within this harsh routine, the cook developed sharp awareness. She observed moods, routines, and hierarchies. She knew who ate what, who drank heavily, who trusted blindly. Her daily life, though controlled, placed her at the center of the household's most intimate moments, feeding them, sustaining them, and learning their weaknesses without ever being acknowledged. This existence, unseen, overworked, and constantly threatened, shaped the quiet endurance of the enslaved cook. It also planted the seeds of awareness that, under extreme desperation, could turn survival into something far more dangerous. Power in enslaved households was absolute and one-sided. Enslaved cooks lived under a system where obedience was not requested. It was demanded, enforced through fear, punishment, and the constant threat of violence or sale. Silence was not a choice. It was a requirement for survival. Speaking out, questioning orders, or showing emotion could be interpreted as defiance and punished severely. The enslaved cook learned quickly that her voice had no value. Complaints about exhaustion, hunger, or mistreatment were ignored or met with cruelty. Even when abused unjustly, she was expected to continue working as if nothing had happened. Pain had to be swallowed, grief hidden, anger buried deep. Silence became armor, thin, fragile, but necessary. This forced obedience created a dangerous illusion for enslavers. Because the cook rarely spoke and always performed her duties, she was seen as loyal, harmless, even grateful. The household mistook submission for acceptance. They believed control over her body meant control over her thoughts, never considering what might be forming behind her quiet exterior. Power was reinforced through unpredictability. Punishments were often arbitrary, sometimes for real mistakes, sometimes simply to remind her who held authority. This unpredictability kept her in a constant state of tension, never knowing when kindness would turn to cruelty. Obedience under such conditions was not loyalty, it was survival under terror. Yet silence did not mean emptiness. While her mouth stayed closed, her mind remained alert. Every insult, every beating, every humiliation was remembered. Forced obedience compressed rage into something internal and controlled. The absence of open resistance did not erase resentment, it refined it. In this world, power believed itself untouchable, protected by fear and silence. But silence can be deceptive. When a person is denied every form of justice, denied even the right to speak, the quiet they maintain can become something far more dangerous than open rebellion. The wedding day was meant to be a spectacle of wealth, status, and control. From early morning, the household buzzed with excitement. Guests arriving, decorations arranged, music rehearsed. But behind the celebration was relentless labor, and at its center stood the enslaved cook, carrying the heaviest burden of all. While others dressed in fine clothes and spoke of love and joy, she worked non-stop, preparing a feast meant to impress dozens of guests. Weddings were the most demanding days for an enslaved cook. The menu was larger, richer, and far more complex than usual. Multiple courses, rare ingredients, sweets reserved only for special occasions. There was no room for error. Every dish had to be perfect, every flavor balanced, every plate served on time. Failure on a normal day brought punishment. Failure on a wedding day could bring brutal consequences. Supervision intensified as the hours passed. Family members entered the kitchen repeatedly, tasting, criticizing, giving orders. The cook was watched closely, not out of concern but out of entitlement. She was expected to remain calm, invisible, and obedient despite exhaustion. Her hands moved constantly, chopping, stirring, roasting, while her face revealed nothing. Ironically, this chaos created opportunity. The wedding preparations overwhelmed the household's normal routines. Ingredients were taken out in bulk, storage unlocked. Herbs and spices moved freely across the kitchen. In the rush to impress guests, trust replaced caution. The enslaved cook, assumed to be powerless and loyal, was given access no one questioned. Emotionally, the day carried another layer of cruelty. A wedding symbolized commitment, choice, and celebration, everything denied to her. As vows were prepared upstairs, she stood below, forced to help celebrate a future she could never claim. Each dish she prepared became a reminder of what had been stolen from her life. By the time the feast was nearly ready, the household believed everything was under control. They saw only a successful celebration ahead. What they did not see was that the wedding day preparations, meant to glorify power, had quietly removed its defenses, setting the stage for a transformation no one imagined. In enslaved households, food was not just nourishment. It was a tool of power. Those who controlled the kitchen controlled survival itself. Enslavers decided who ate, when they ate, and how much they were allowed. Enslaved people were often given scraps or inferior food, while being forced to prepare rich meals they could never enjoy. Hunger was used deliberately, a quiet punishment that left no visible marks. For the enslaved cook, this cruelty carried a bitter irony. She was responsible for feeding everyone else, while her own needs were ignored. She knew the smells of roasted meats and fresh bread intimately, yet was often denied a full meal. Preparing abundance while living in deprivation was part of the psychological control, reminding her daily that her labor sustained lives deemed more valuable than her own. Food also reinforced hierarchy within the household. Special dishes were reserved for honored guests, celebrations, and moments of pride, while enslaved people remained excluded from the table. The cook learned exactly which meals symbolized power and status. She understood that a wedding feast was not just food. It was a public display of dominance, wealth, and entitlement. Because of this, the kitchen became one of the few places where control subtly shifted hands. The enslaved cook followed orders, but she also handled every ingredient. She measured, prepared, and served what others consumed without question. The family's belief in her obedience allowed them to lower their guard, never considering that the person who fed them daily possessed unseen influence. This dynamic created a dangerous imbalance. Enslavers believed control flowed only one way, from master to servant. But food blurred that certainty. The very system designed to dominate relied on the cook's labor and knowledge. Trust was enforced, not earned, and that false trust became a weakness. In a world where enslaved people were denied weapons, voices, and justice, food remained one of the few forms of quiet power left to them. And when control is built on cruelty, even the most ordinary acts like serving a meal, can carry consequences far beyond what anyone expects. Enslaved cooks were forced into a strange and dangerous education. Through years of labor, they learned far more than recipes. They absorbed knowledge about plants, roots, spices, and remedies used for cooking, healing, and survival. This knowledge often came from African traditions, indigenous practices, and folk medicine quietly passed between enslaved people, always shared in whispers, always hidden from overseers. Much of this learning was born from necessity. With little access to doctors or proper care, enslaved communities relied on herbal knowledge to treat sickness, ease pain, and survive harsh conditions. The cook, working daily with ingredients, became especially familiar with what could heal and what could harm. She knew which plants cause sickness if misused, which combinations could weaken the body, and which substances were never meant to be consumed at all. Importantly, this knowledge was not taught as a weapon, it was taught as protection. But in a system where justice did not exist for the enslaved, understanding the line between medicine and danger carried a heavy, unspoken weight. Knowledge itself became power, even if it could never be openly acknowledged. Enslavers often underestimated this intelligence. They assumed enslaved cooks followed recipes mechanically, unaware of the depth of understanding behind their work. Herbs and spices were treated as harmless flavorings, not realizing that the person preparing them understood their effects far better than anyone at the table. This ignorance created a fatal confidence. Kitchens stored substances for cleaning, preservation, pest control, and medicine, items meant to be handled carefully, but rarely guarded. The enslaved cook, trusted through forced obedience, moved freely among them without raising suspicion. In a world where physical resistance meant death, knowledge became something quieter and more dangerous. The understanding of herbs and poisons, gained through suffering, passed through generations, and hidden behind silence, represented one of the few forms of power that could not be taken away. And once that line was crossed, there was no turning back. For an enslaved cook, acting against her oppressors required more than courage. It demanded careful planning, secrecy, and patience. Every movement in the kitchen, every gesture, had to be calculated to avoid suspicion. Unlike in open rebellion, where groups might rise together, she worked alone, knowing that one careless glance or overheard word could mean immediate punishment or, worse, death. Planning without witnesses was not optional. It was a necessity for survival. The cook had to observe the household's routines with almost surgical precision. She learned when the family slept, when guests arrived, when servants and overseers came and went. She tracked who handled ingredients, which doors were locked, and when attention was celebrations or distractions. These small observations, seemingly mundane, were crucial. In a household built on power, hierarchy, and surveillance, even a minor misstep could expose her intentions. Silence was part of the strategy. The cook could speak to no one about her plans. Any hint of anger or resentment could be misread as defiance, and confessions often traveled faster than the truth. Her thoughts, her intentions, and her understanding of poisons or remedies had to remain invisible to all. Planning became a mental exercise as much as a physical one, a way to convert knowledge and patience into potential power. The tools for her plan were already within reach, yet required careful timing. Herbs, spices, and other kitchen substances were handled daily, making her movements appear routine. Guests' arrival and the chaos of celebration provided cover, but the risk was always present. She had to anticipate every possibility: a curious child entering the kitchen, an overseer checking on preparations, even a sudden change in the schedule. In essence, the cook became a master of invisibility. She turned obedience into camouflage, her every act hiding intent beneath layers of routine. Planning without witnesses was more than strategy. It was a survival mechanism, a quiet rebellion against a system that denied her every right. And when executed perfectly, it allowed her to turn the very tools of her oppression into instruments of justice, unseen until it was too late for those who had underestimated her. The moment the wedding feast was served marked the culmination of months of preparation, tension, and unspoken planning. For the enslaved cook, this was the most delicate and dangerous part of her day. Every dish she placed on the table was the result of years of labor, but hidden beneath the surface was something far more potent than spices or sauces, a carefully concealed instrument of revenge. As the family and guests gathered around the table, excitement and laughter filled the room. They admired the spread of roasted meats, savory sides, delicate pastries, and sweet confections, completely unaware that the very hands that presented the food were the same hands that had endured years of abuse, humiliation, and oppression. To them, she was a loyal servant, her obedience unquestioned. That blind trust gave her freedom within the very walls where she was most controlled. The act of serving was both ordinary and extraordinary. To outsiders, she appeared calm, moving gracefully between platters, offering dishes with practiced politeness, but every step was calculated. Timing mattered: when to serve which guests, how to present each course, and how to ensure no suspicion was raised. The chaos of a wedding, guests chatting, children running, music playing, provided perfect cover for her actions. The guests, focused on celebration, never noticed the subtle manipulations in the food. Ingredients that seemed harmless were carefully mixed, portions discreetly arranged, and dishes presented with a smile that masked years of anger. Her expertise in the kitchen allowed her to disguise intention within normalcy. The perfect meal became a tool of quiet, lethal strategy. Serving the feast also meant maintaining an outward appearance of subservience. The cook could not show satisfaction or relief, nor could she reveal even a hint of the power she held in that moment. Her silence and composure were weapons, masking the danger in plain sight. By the time everyone had tasted the food, the cook had already executed the most critical stage of her plan. The ordinary act of serving, a task she had performed countless times under scrutiny, was transformed into a decisive, irreversible moment. The wedding celebration, a display of wealth and control, had unknowingly become the stage for the cook's ultimate assertion of agency, carried out silently and invisibly. The feast was no longer just a meal. It was a turning point, where years of suffering, knowledge, and careful planning converged to demonstrate that power is not always where it seems to lie. The laughter, music, and clinking of glasses at the wedding suddenly gave way to confusion and terror. Guests who had been enjoying the lavish feast began to complain of nausea, dizziness, and sharp pains in their stomachs. What had moments ago seemed like a perfect celebration quickly descended into chaos. Faces twisted in shock as people realized something was terribly wrong. The family, proud and confident just minutes before, now stared at one another in disbelief, unable to understand how the day of joy had turned into a scene of horror. The onset of illness was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. A guest might quietly set down a fork, excuse themselves, or feel a wave of weakness. But as more and more people began to fall ill, panic spread rapidly through the room. Servants ran for water, children cried, and the music halted abruptly. What had been a controlled environment of order and celebration now became a whirlwind of fear and confusion. For the enslaved cook, the reaction in the dining room was both tense and surreal. She had spent years hidden in plain sight, enduring abuse and humiliation, but now the culmination of her knowledge, planning, and patience was playing out before her eyes. She observed the chaos quietly, carefully, making no sudden movements, maintaining the appearance of obedience as the household crumbled around her. The suddenness of the illness left the family powerless. Doctors or overseers could only attempt remedies, but the effects of the hidden substances, the knowledge she had painstakingly acquired over years, worked too quickly and too effectively. Panic replaced pride, and the entire wedding celebration, once a symbol of wealth and control, devolved into a scene of fear and helplessness. Guests, who had moments ago toasted to love and unity, now faced the fragility of life itself. The wedding that was meant to be a demonstration of power and social status had, in an instant, revealed the illusion of control. In this moment of vulnerability, the cook, who had always been forced into silence and invisibility, had reclaimed agency in the most profound and irreversible way. By the time the magnitude of the illness became clear, it was too late for the family to understand or prevent what had happened. The room, meant to celebrate life and continuity, had become a stage for a quiet, devastating reversal of power. The effects of the meal were undeniable, shocking, and irreversible, leaving behind a legacy of terror, disbelief, and the stark reality of a carefully concealed vengeance. What began as a day of celebration and joy quickly transformed into a scene of tragedy and horror. Guests, initially chatting and laughing over the beautifully arranged tables, now clutched their stomachs in agony. The wedding, meant to mark union and happiness, had become a chamber of fear. Panic swept through the household as more family members and attendees fell ill, their laughter replaced by groans of pain and terror. The vibrant energy of the celebration turned into a somber, chaotic atmosphere almost overnight. The family's disbelief was immediate. They could not comprehend how a meal prepared with apparent care and skill could suddenly destroy their day, and in some cases, their lives. Wealth and social status, which had protected them in every other aspect of life, offered no shield against what had transpired. Doctors were summoned, servants rushed about, and neighbors came running, but the damage had already been done. By the time help arrived, the once proud household had begun to realize that death was imminent for some of the guests. Rooms that had been filled with music and dancing were now occupied by beds and makeshift resting areas. Children were comforted as parents succumbed to illness. Friends and extended family members hovered anxiously, unsure of who would recover and who would not. The joyous rituals of a wedding, the exchanging of vows, the clinking of glasses, the smiles and toasts, had been replaced by quiet sobs, urgent whispers, and a mounting sense of dread. For the enslaved cook, the transformation from wedding to funeral marked the silent triumph of years of suffering and strategic patience. She had been forced to labor, endure abuse, and remain invisible for all those years, but now the power dynamic had shifted. The very hands that were long oppressed had delivered a judgment that no words could express. The kitchen, once a place of forced labor and humiliation, had become the epicenter of control, influence, and irreversible action. The speed with which celebration turned into catastrophe underscored the fragility of life under such circumstances and the hidden vulnerabilities within the household system. A day meant for unity and joy had instead exposed the illusion of dominance and the unseen intelligence of those considered powerless. Guests who had arrived to honor love and family were confronted with the stark reality of mortality and the consequences of underestimating someone they had deemed invisible. In the end, the wedding day left behind only a somber reminder power can be fleeting, and silence can be more dangerous than rebellion when wielded with precision. What had been meant to celebrate life now served as a haunting testament to vengeance, resilience, and the grim consequences of cruelty unchecked. After the catastrophic wedding feast, the focus of the household shifted entirely, from celebration to crisis management. Guests were sick, some critically so, and panic consumed every corner of the estate. Amid this chaos, the enslaved cook quietly disappeared, leaving no trace behind. While everyone else was frantically trying to save the afflicted or call for help, she moved unseen. Slipping away from the epicenter of fear she had orchestrated with meticulous precision. Her disappearance was as calculated as the events that led to it. She had spent years understanding the rhythms of the household, the comings and goings of overseers, the timing of meals, and the patterns of surveillance. On the wedding day, these observations allowed her to act with confidence, ensuring that she could vanish at the precise moment her presence might draw suspicion. To the family, she had been the invisible servant, loyal and obedient, and that perception worked to her advantage. By leaving quietly, she denied the household the ability to seek retribution. They were distracted by the immediate emergency, caring for the sick, assessing the damage, and grappling with the sudden reversal of power. No one initially suspected her of wrongdoing. Their trust, built on years of assumed obedience and silenced submission, blinded them to the fact that the person closest to their food and daily routines had orchestrated the disaster. Her disappearance also highlights the cruel paradox of her life as an enslaved person. Even as she exercised her most decisive act of agency, she still had to remain invisible, moving without recognition or acknowledgement. Any overt claim to the actions she had taken could have resulted in capture, punishment, or death. Freedom at that moment was measured not by open rebellion but by the ability to walk away unnoticed. Over time, the cook's absence became another unsettling element of the story. Families and historians were left to puzzle over her fate, unable to trace her path or determine whether she had survived, escaped, or simply vanished into the network of enslaved communities that existed beyond the estate. Her disappearance became a symbol of both the limits and the reach of enslaved agency, powerless in the public eye, yet capable of extraordinary acts in secrecy. Ultimately, her vanishing act completed the arc from silent suffering to invisible power. She had endured humiliation, exploitation, and fear for years, but in the end, she controlled the outcome of the day and removed herself from harm, leaving behind a legacy of mystery, vengeance, and the unsettling reminder that the most overlooked people sometimes wield the greatest unseen power. The story of the enslaved cook's act of vengeance did not end with the wedding or even with her disappearance. In the broader sweep of history, it was quietly buried, overshadowed by the daily records of wealth, property, and social events that dominated plantation life. Newspapers might report sudden deaths as mysterious illnesses or accidental poisoning, but rarely did they acknowledge the agency or suffering of the enslaved people behind such acts. Her revenge became a footnote, a story whispered in secret or forgotten entirely, hidden beneath the weight of history written by the powerful. This quiet, forgotten revenge highlights a harsh truth. Enslaved people often had no legal or social recourse to address the abuses they endured. Acts of open resistance could, and often did, lead to brutal punishment, sale, or death. Yet even under extreme oppression, they found ways to assert their humanity and agency. The cook's careful planning, her knowledge of herbs and poisons, and her ability to act invisibly turned the tools of her oppression, the kitchen, the food, the household routine, into instruments of retribution. Her story also reveals the limits of historical records. Most accounts of plantation life focus on the enslavers, their wealth, marriages, disputes, and social events. The perspectives of the enslaved, their intelligence, their strategies, and their acts of resistance were rarely recorded. In this silence, however, lies the profound power of memory, oral tradition, and the legacies of quiet rebellion. The cook's revenge, though largely unacknowledged in official records, stands as a testament to resilience, cunning, and the enduring human spirit. Moreover, this event serves as a symbolic reversal of the power dynamics in slavery. The enslaved, systematically denied freedom and subjected to endless cruelty, turned the very structures of control into a weapon. The wedding feast, a symbol of dominance, social status, and celebration, became the stage for a deadly, yet invisible, assertion of agency. Though her act could not dismantle the system of slavery, it demonstrated that power could be contested even in the most restricted circumstances. History may have forgotten her name or obscured the details of her life, but the essence of her actions remains clear. Revenge does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers quietly, concealed within obedience, patience, and knowledge. The cook's story reminds us that those written out of history often wielded forms of influence that were invisible yet profoundly impactful. Her quiet, forgotten revenge is a lasting testament to survival, resistance, and the human capacity to reclaim power even in the darkest of circumstances.